This video contains full spoilers for Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2, as well as the entirety of the Tomorrowverse. Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1 kinda shocked me with how good the story was, as it managed to tell this really interesting non-linear story focusing on the Flash, while also adapting really well the beginning of Crisis on Infinite Earths up until the Flash's death, while putting an interesting twist on it. After that, my expectations for Part 2 did become a bit higher, although I did remain skeptical that the Tomorrowverse one managed to pull off two great movies in a row, and while that did technically end up being correct, Part 2 isn't what I would call great, it did manage to hold together a coherent story while including some nice twists and turns that made for a pretty good movie that, while not as great as Part 1, does make for a good bridging between Parts 1 and 3. At least for now, it seems that way. This video will be my review for Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2. In Part 1, I started off the review saying that it wasn't really a Justice League movie, rather a Flash movie, at least in its focus. Part 2 is definitely less focused on just one character, with the likes of Supergirl, the Monitor, and Psycho Pirate all arguably being equally as much the main character as each other, while some non-insignificant focus is put on Batman, Wonder Woman, Kandy, and Green Lantern. This does make the movie less focused, which, given the restrictions on the runtime and budget, is something that doesn't really work as well. Maybe because of that, Part 1 will just end up being naturally the best movie in this trilogy because Parts 2 and 3 are telling a little bit bigger stories that focus on more characters, which maybe they simply aren't able to pull off as well or as effectively within the constraints they have. So this is not actually a complaint about the focus. I think they actually focus relatively well on the three main characters. It's more so a complaint about the budget, which I guess there's nothing you could really do about at this point, but I might as well talk about it here because it is the biggest thing that's holding this movie and honestly the entirety of the Tomorrowverse back. This is most apparent when the Shadow Demons are on screen. They look good, but they also do a lot of just like standing around in the background whenever other characters are doing anything. Beyond that, the animation is pretty limited in most action scenes, with just a handful of exceptions. This was entirely expected given how low budget the Tomorrowverse has always felt, but that doesn't change how much it affects the movies. Batman is at the forefront of the poster, had like the most screen time in the trailers, and is the focus of the beginning of the movie, which definitely gave me the impression that he'll end up being the main character. But while he did get more focus than most, he did not have a large enough role for me to consider him one of the main characters, which is a good thing in my opinion, because Batman didn't have a large role in the original Crisis either, because honestly, how could he? That being said, the Tomorrowverse had the rather unique idea of Earth 1 Batman not having any sidekicks, while Earth 2 has an entire Bat family, and also the Batman of that world is dead. From which we got some interesting interactions, some fun moments, and good conflict brought on by Psycho Pirate's emotional manipulation between the Bat family. Although I do think that the movie wasted a bit too much time and animation on the Batman rogues focused opening scene. Batgirl is on the poster, and yet for some reason she kind of just disappears ever so often in this movie and does not have a very large role. And while it was awesome to hear Will Friedel's voice coming from Batman Beyond, I wish he had more than just like one or two lines. The movie then turns focus to the Psycho Pirate, who's given an even larger focus than I expected as his backstory is shown off. This is one of the better parts of Part 2. Psycho Pirate's backstory is dark and disturbing. He comes off as like a young serial killer in the making, and the way they used his unique abilities made for some really interesting and disturbing scenes. It also connects really well with the already established canon of Justice Society World War II, aside from one thing, which I'll get back to soon. It was cool to see how they told his backstory and how it connected to his appearance in that movie, all overlaid by some great narration from Psycho Pirate himself while he's torturing Kent Nelson, which also took place during World War II. The one inconsistent thing is that he's wearing this Psycho Pirate costume during the torturing of Kent Nelson, which he never wore in his first appearance, and he didn't get until Crisis Part 1. Still, this moment is pretty cool. We see Dr. Fate in his full glory for the first time, and his design, dialogue, and voice are all pretty much perfect. It isn't quite explained in this movie why Dr. Fate gave Psycho Pirate his multiverse traveling abilities in this movie. I'm sure it will be in Part 3, and it's probably going to be revealed that they needed all of what he caused to happen in order to win. Kind of like Doctor Strange watching the future in Infinity War, but for now, it does remain an interesting mystery that I'm hoping they do explain. Beyond that, Psycho Pirate's little manipulations and interactions with other characters like the Monitor and Blue Beetle were always really entertaining to watch. And then through him, we met the Anti-Monitor for the first time. The scene characterizes the Anti-Monitor, and the movie does as well, a bit differently than I expected. Based on this scene, he seemed to be a being made out of light, while later on he seemed seems to be a being made out of shadows, and in this scene he has a bit of a childlike demeanor motivated by his absolute complete hatred of the Monitor. Still, this was a pretty great introduction to the character and was done at, I think, a really great time in the trilogy. Not too early, not too late. We'll get back to the Anti-Monitor later on, but looking at the Psycho Pirate again, his entire story was really interesting, really entertaining, and really engaging. And where it all led to was really interesting. First, because he was manipulated by the Anti-Monitor into thinking that he's going to become a god. Obviously, the Anti-Monitor is not going to do that. He's going to destroy everything. But also because how he sowed hatred between the heroes, which was effective. My favorite was how he was able to help adapt the moment from the comics where Harbinger kills the Monitor, and did it in a way that I think improved over the original. In order to talk about that, we'll need to first talk about the other focuses of that pivotal moment and the other two focuses of this movie, Supergirl and the Monitor. The movie reveals from pretty early on that Supergirl was actually meant to die in this world as she was escaping Krypton, but was saved by the Monitor by mistake before then spending a few ageless decades on his satellite. Part 1 revealed that Lila Michaels doesn't exist in this world and that Harbinger is actually Supergirl, and I mentioned in my review that I'm going to be waiting until Part 2 to pass judgment on that change. And here we are. Now that Part 2 is out, I can say that not only did they completely justify the change, but also did some really interesting things with it. Some things that, like I already mentioned, improved over the original. First off, they did a great job in my opinion of incorporating the Monitor into Supergirl's backstory, using him and his satellite to explain how Kara got sidetracked for a few decades and why she didn't age during that time, before then coming to Earth. Secondly, the father-daughter dynamic that was brought about by the situation was really interesting, especially with how Kara managed to change Novu's approach to emotion just through her presence. And then, even more so than that, how she changed his mindset in regards to interfering through viewing her heroic actions as Supergirl from the events of Legion of Superheroes, which, just as a side note, I already mentioned that this movie connects to Legion of Superheroes and Justice Society World War II. It also mentions and connects to Green Lantern Beware My Power. Part 1 connected to a few movies. These two movies have already done a really good job at connecting the Tomorrowverse together, making it feel like a more coherent story than it was beforehand. That Monitor-Supergirl dynamic is something that I really loved about this movie. Supergirl, just by acting by her nature and also following by her cousin's heroic lead, managed to inspire a billion-year-old godlike figure to act when he was not supposed to. This also allowed the Monitor to show some character and development that, combined with his fantastic voice, his great dialogue, interesting relationship with Kara, and unique perspective on the universe that was brought out through his dialogue, made him a far more interesting, far more captivating, and far more three-dimensional character compared to Part 1, and also just more than I expected, making his death also feel all the more sad. Speaking of death, I was surprised that Supergirl survived this movie, although thinking about it, maybe having a movie that focuses on a character twice in a row where that character ends the movie dying would have felt a bit repetitive, so if anything, they ended the movie a bit more interestingly than I expected, and maybe Supergirl's death will be adapted in Part 3, where the fact that she's imbued now by a bit of the Monitor's powers, unlike the comics, will make it more realistic for her to hold her own against the Anti-Monitor by herself, like she did in the comics. And then, the movie did a really great job at connecting Kara's backstory to their own version of the moment from the comics where Harbinger kills the Monitor. In the comics, as well as in the Arrowverse, Harbinger was simply being controlled by the Anti-Monitor who took over her body. Here, Supergirl was affected by Psycho Pirate's emotion-changing abilities, enhanced by both the Monitor and the Anti-Monitor, to manipulate Kara using the conflict that already existed between her and the Anti-Monitor, one that feels very natural. The fact that he just watched as Krypton died, since he had not yet changed as a person, which was brought about by Supergirl herself. It's actually really interesting when you think about it. This was a really clever twist on the comic moment that effectively used the three main characters and also the main villain together, while incorporating Supergirl's origin, which was combined with Harbinger's, to make for an improved and more effective scene compared to the comics and the Arrowverse. Now, Supergirl's role in this movie wasn't perfect, nor was it ever as effective as the Flash in Part 1, but I did predict in my review for Part 1 that Supergirl will be the main character in Part 2, and while she wasn't the only one, I do think they did a good job of giving her a level of importance and a good enough story, while Part 2 also definitely did a really good job of writing a story that climaxes by bringing together the three main characters into one pivotal moment, justifying it being those three characters that were given focus, also justifying that instead of Lila Michaels as Harbinger, that character does not exist, and it is Supergirl. Beyond the main three, the movie had a lot more heroes, some of whom have only really like a line or two, others had no lines and didn't appear until the end, and others did have some focus. The animation budget was definitely felt in this regard, as while Part 1 showed off nearly like 100 characters, it never felt like there was more than maybe a dozen or two in Part 2. It was a especially noticeable with how low staffed each tower was. Now that can also be that there are just hundreds of worlds left, I'm not sure, but also at the same time, the more worlds there are, the more heroes there should be. Still, I did appreciate it when someone who otherwise didn't appear much at least had a line, because that did make the movie feel a bit more populated by real people than otherwise. And then there are those who, while not main characters, were given some focus, chief among them being Batman, who I already went over. Beyond that, there's Wonder Woman, whose role of teaming up with the Amazonians of the Amazonian-led world of Earth 46 could have been interesting, given that this version of Wonder Woman's home was completely destroyed. But I don't think it ever really managed to reach anything interesting beyond Wonder Woman's immortality, foreshadowing her surviving the antimatter wave. Similar to how she survived the end of the universe in a comic event called Future State, this would honestly be really cool, especially if that allows Wonder Woman to have a large role in Part 3. If she didn't survive and simply died, that would be a very anticlimactic death, and then I wouldn't really understand why her tiara was still seen, why that wasn't destroyed. So I'm hoping that in Part 3 she comes back and has a pivotal role, otherwise it would be an anticlimactic death. Speaking of anticlimactic, I have to say that a lot of Green Lantern's part here left a bit to be desired, especially since he is one of the main characters of the Tomorrowverse. He had his own movie, so that is probably the reason they gave him a role in this movie at all. It was, like his original movie, pretty disappointing. Everything up until John Constantine showed up was fine, but not very memorable. Once he does show up, there are some moments that are really interesting, like I really like the moment of him calling himself a pariah and then turning into his true self. But the thing that brought that on, of Jon Stewart saying he's not Green Lantern, that's just his job, and his name is John, he didn't even say his whole name, that was so forced and so contrived. Like, that was genuinely some bad writing. Then, Green Lantern sacrificing his power ring to defeat the Shadow Demons could have been a cool moment in theory, maybe if there were more Shadow Demons, and maybe if he wasn't being overshadowed by John Constantine the entire time, maybe if the music was a bit better, maybe if he actually finished the Green Lantern Oath. All in all, it never felt like the Lantern Battery Blast was even necessary, and the sacrifice of his powers was honestly so lame. And so the Tomorrowverse just continues to disappoint in regards to the Green Lanterns. Also in Part 1, Hal Jordan showed up and then he just did nothing and left. What's far better was Kandy and Solivar's roles. Two characters who I was surprised got such large roles, but I'm glad they did. Both of them had large roles in the original comic. Kandy was used to hint at the crisis in Justice Society World War II, and he had his own short set in the Tomorrowverse. Although they only had like 2 scenes, the movie did kind of manage to cultivate a tiny bit of a friendship between Solivar and Kandy, which allowed Solivar's death to feel significant. Definitely there was not enough time to make the death feel emotional, but because they added some dimensions to the character, and he's not one of the characters who just sticks to the background and never talks, it did make his death feel like it added a bit more stakes to the movie. The movie then ends on a surprising beat and another deviation from the comics, as the Shadow Demons are revealed to actually be extensions of the Anti-Monitor, who come together to form one giant Shadow Demon, who then forms an armor, as it's clear that this is indeed the Anti-Monitor. This was a clever way to get rid of the Shadow Demon's army, who would just be impossible to animate alongside the Anti-Monitor in Part 3 and all of these heroes, while transitioning into the big Anti-Monitor showdown, which is not at the dawn of time at this point, although Part 3 has 90 minutes to cover, so maybe that will happen. That being said, I do not like the Anti-Monitor design. I really hope he becomes more comic accurate looking in Part 3, but also the actual ending of the movie where he's charging up the beam to shoot at the heroes could have been handled way better. That was a really anticlimactic ending, if I'm being honest, especially with it coming right after the Monitor's climactic death. Talking about some generalities beyond the animation, I'd say that visually this movie definitely has its moments, but nowhere near Part 1's visuals. The writing is mostly really good, the story is great, the dialogue is effective, and the voice acting is really good for the most part. There's a very nice peppering of some comedy here, like Psycho Pirate saying he loves Nazis, Blue Beetle saying he always liked that guy after Psycho Pirate disappeared, or honestly every single time the Question talked. I did genuinely laugh a handful of times, but only a handful of times, meaning the comedy in the series didn't overstay its welcome, allowing the serious and heavy nature of the story to still definitely be felt with just a few much needed moments of levity. Finally, the music was pretty good. Mostly it was just used well in the movie, but this time around there was even some memorable music, specifically Psycho Pirate's theme from Justice Society World War II, which was absolutely appropriately sinister. And so, while Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2 wasn't as good as Part 1 and had its disappointing moments, it also had some surprising moments that worked better than expected. It did a good job at focusing on the characters it focused on while telling a story that ultimately brings them together, all coupled with good voice acting, decent visuals, good music, great dialogue, some effective comedy, a mostly consistently and appropriately somber tone, and some interesting usage of certain characters. The animation was noticeably limited, some characters' appearances left a bit to be desired, even in the writing department, and nothing happens in this movie that impressed me to the level that part 1 did, but all in all, I wouldn't say I'm disappointed by part 2, which I'd give a solid 7 out of 10. Here's hoping part 2 works well as the bridging between parts 1 and 3, and that part 3 somehow manages to outdo part 1, or at the very least manages to be as good, and successfully cap off this universe, which admittedly does sound like a very difficult task. Here's hoping they pull it off, and thanks for watching.